What if one man's act of kindness quietly changed the course of a dozen lives, starting with a bride who thought she'd never walk down the aisle again? This isn't just a story about a custom-built wedding ride. It's about grief, healing, and the kind of love that builds miracles from brokenness. And when 10 black SUVs arrive unannounced, everything changes. If stories like this speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting tales that celebrate the power of kindness and second chances. Now, let me take you to a small-town garage where hope was rebuilt, one wheel at a time. The wrench slipped again. Chris muttered under his breath and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. Outside, the Colorado spring was still flirting with winter. Patches of snow melting beneath weak sunlight, leaving muddy slush that clung to boots like regret. Inside the garage, it was warm, not from insulation, but from memory. The radio crackled in the background, playing a low jazz tune he hadn't changed in years. It was his late wife's favorite station. Sometimes, when he caught a familiar melody, he'd stop and let it play through, closing his eyes like he was catching a voice on the breeze. Today wasn't one of those days. Chris Reeves, 42, widower, mechanic, single father. Labels, like rust, had a way of sticking, but it was the single father one that weighed the most. From the workbench, he glanced at the photo above the dusty calendar. There she was, Maggie, smiling as she held their newborn son, Eli, in the crook of her arm. That photo had survived 2 moves, a fire in the shop's back room, and grief. Lots of it. "Dad!" a young voice called from outside. Chris stepped into the doorway, blinking against the sun. Eli, now 8, was trying to balance a soccer ball on one knee and failing miserably. He grinned at his dad with the kind of freedom only children have. "You coming in soon?" Eli asked. "I made peanut butter and jelly, heavy on the jelly. Like you like it." Chris nodded, heart tugged. "In a minute, buddy." The boy ran back inside, tracking wet footprints onto the floorboards Maggie used to polish until they shined. Chris turned back to his work, then paused. He felt it, the weight of being needed, and the hollow echo that followed when no one asked how he was doing anymore. He was tightening the final bolt on a rusted axle when the knock came. 2 firm raps, then silence. Strange. Folks didn't come to his garage unless something was broken. He opened the door slowly. She stood there, mid-40s maybe, a few strands of silver hair tucked behind her ear, eyes the soft blue of worn denim. She wore scrubs beneath a quilted jacket and held a file folder close to her chest like it was a lifeline. "Are you Chris Reeves?" she asked, voice warm but cautious. "I am," he replied, instinctively wiping his hands on a rag. "What can I help you with?" "I'm Lena. I work at the rehabilitation clinic across town. I'm also the legal guardian of my niece, Claire." Her voice faltered slightly. "She's getting married in 2 weeks." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Congratulations?" "She's paralyzed from the waist down, spinal cord injury, a car accident 6 months ago." Lena's voice didn't waver. She'd practiced this, rehearsed every word. "I'm sorry to hear that," Chris said, softening. "She's determined to go through with the wedding," Lena continued. "But we hit a snag. The venue is rustic. Narrow aisle. No ramps. No elegant way to get her from the car to the altar." Chris blinked. "What about a wheelchair?" "She refuses. Said she doesn't want to feel like a patient on her wedding day. She wants to feel beautiful, celebrated, moved." Chris leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And you want me to do what exactly?" "Build her something," Lena said, stepping closer. "Something special. A ride, wheeled, comfortable, something safe but elegant, something that doesn't scream medical equipment." She saw a photo online of a custom wedding cart a mechanic built for a child once. I tracked it down. That mechanic was you. Chris froze. That cart was from 2 years ago. A last-minute request from a mother whose daughter was born without legs. Maggie had still been alive. She was the one who insisted he say yes. "Don't you dare say no," she had whispered, holding his hand. "Kindness can build miracles." That memory swirled through him like wind through ash. "I'll pay," Lena added quickly. "I know you're not a charity." "It's not about money," he interrupted, voice low. "It's about time. And whether or not I can still do it." Lena's gaze didn't falter. "Can you?" Chris looked past her, out at the gravel road leading to nowhere, then back at the quiet garage behind him. He sighed. "I'll take a look at what I've got," he said. "Come back tomorrow." For a moment, Lena just stood there. Then she smiled. It wasn't wide, but it was genuine. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." "Chris." "Thank you, Chris." As she turned and walked away, Chris stood in the doorway a long time. The jazz had stopped playing. A breeze moved through the garage, stirring sawdust and memory. The quiet was no longer comforting. It was an invitation. He walked back to the workbench, slowly. Then he opened the drawer where he hadn't looked in years. Inside, folded neatly, was Maggie's old sketch pad. She used to doodle while he worked. On the first page was a rough drawing of a little cart, all flowers and lace and joy. In the corner, a note in her handwriting. "For someone who just wants to feel special." Chris closed his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, kindness could still build miracles. Chris barely slept that night. Long after Eli had gone to bed, Chris sat in the dim glow of the garage's hanging bulb, his elbows resting on the workbench, staring at Maggie's old sketchbook. Her doodles were a mix of the whimsical and the practical. Wheels with ribbons, elegant woodwork, little hearts drawn in corners. She used to joke she was the dreamer, and he was the builder. That had always been their rhythm. But without her, he hadn't felt like much of a builder, just a man patching up things too broken to matter. The next morning, Chris fixed Eli's breakfast, packed his school bag, and walked him to the bus. The boy turned back at the last second and waved, his smile toothy and wide. Chris stood at the curb, hand in his pocket, until the yellow bus disappeared down the road. Then he walked slowly back toward the garage. He didn't even hear Lena approach. "Morning," she said gently, not wanting to startle him. Chris looked up. She was wearing the same jacket as yesterday, but today her eyes carried less tension, more hope. "You came back." "You said to," she smiled. "I didn't want to test your patience." Chris opened the garage door fully. "Come in. I've been thinking about what you asked." He motioned toward the workbench. Pinned across it was a sheet of butcher paper, and on it, Chris had begun to sketch. A soft gasp escaped Lena's lips. It was a rough outline, a cross between a Victorian stroller and a sleigh, with gently curved wooden armrests and wide back wheels for balance. The front had a tapering slope, designed for a soft landing. There were tiny notes in the margins. Wheel brake here. Folding footrest. Leather cushions. "It's beautiful," Lena whispered. Chris glanced sideways. "It's just a start. I'll need time, and I'll have to dig through what I have in storage. I haven't built anything this delicate in a long while." Lena stepped closer. "Do you need help?" Chris blinked. "You know how to use power tools?" "No," she chuckled. "But I can hand you things, sweep sawdust, talk to you while you work." He hesitated, then nodded. "I could use the company." She smiled, more openly this time, and removed her jacket, revealing the blue scrubs beneath. For the next 2 hours, the garage was filled not just with the smell of old wood and oil, but with quiet conversation. Chris learned that Lena had moved to town 5 years ago, after her husband was killed by a drunk driver. She had no children. Claire, her niece, had been like a daughter to her. Claire was always light, Lena said softly, sanding the edge of a small wooden panel. She danced everywhere, on sidewalks, in grocery aisles, even in parking lots. After the accident, she stopped talking. For weeks. Then one night, she whispered to me, "If I can't walk down the aisle, I still want to move down it." Beautifully. Chris paused mid-stroke with his pencil. "She said that?" he asked, his voice low. Lena nodded. "I told her I'd find a way. I didn't know how. Until yesterday." Something stirred in Chris, a faint pull in his chest. He hadn't felt it in years. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something older, deeper. Recognition. Two people who knew loss when they saw it. After Lena left that afternoon, Chris rummaged through his back shed. Covered in a tarp, beneath years of unused supplies, he found the old wheels from the project Maggie had pushed him into, the one for the girl born without legs. He turned one in his hand. It still spun smoothly. He closed his eyes and whispered, "You still helping me, Mags?" That night, as he and Eli sat on the porch with grilled cheese and tomato soup, Chris mentioned the project. "Can I help?" Eli asked eagerly, crumbs on his shirt. Chris grinned. "You might get dirty." Eli shrugged. "Mom used to say dirt meant you were alive." Chris's chest tightened. He reached over and ruffled his son's hair. The following days passed in a rhythm Chris had almost forgotten. Days filled with purpose. Lena arrived every morning at 8 sharp. She brought coffee in an old thermos, and sometimes scones from the local bakery. She never hovered, never fussed, just worked beside him, asked smart questions, laughed at his dry humor, and listened without trying to fix him. By the end of the week, the frame of the ride was standing tall and solid. Oak and maple, sanded smooth, gently curved. Chris had crafted every joint with precision. But it was more than craftsmanship. It was care. Almost reverence. On Saturday, Lena brought Claire. Chris hadn't expected the girl's silence to strike him so hard. She was small, pale, with intelligent green eyes that looked older than her years. She said nothing as Lena wheeled her in, but she nodded at him politely. Chris guided her to the edge of the garage where the ride stood under a drop cloth. With a quiet breath, he pulled the cloth off. Claire stared. Then, without a word, she reached out and brushed her fingers along the wooden edge. She looked at Chris. For the first time, she smiled. No words. But it was enough. That night, Chris couldn't stop thinking about Claire's smile. It had been barely a curve, just the lift of a corner, fleeting as breath. But it had landed in his chest like a stone dropped in still water. It wasn't just relief or appreciation. It was something rarer. Gratitude wrapped in dignity. He'd seen hundreds of smiles in his life, from customers, from friends, from Maggie. But Claire's smile had cost something to exist, and because of that, it meant more. Chris found himself back in the garage after Eli had gone to bed, his hands tracing the edge of the wooden frame. The wedding ride was far from finished, but already it had shape, soul, the kind of thing you don't build with measurements alone. He lit the old lamp in the corner, the one Maggie used to turn on when sketching. A moth fluttered near the light, then vanished into the shadows. Chris opened a dusty drawer at the base of the bench and found a worn cloth bag. Inside were pieces of leather Maggie had once planned to use for a photo album cover. She'd kept them, even after the album idea faded. "Good leather is like good love," she used to say. "It ages soft." Chris selected a piece the color of chestnut and ran it between his fingers. Tomorrow, he'd cut it into seat cushions. Smooth, strong, beautiful. The next morning brought cold air and gray skies. Rain threatened, though it hadn't quite arrived. Lena showed up with a different thermos, this one mint green, slightly dented. "Caramel chai," she announced, "because yesterday you flinched at the black coffee." Chris smirked, taking it from her. "I didn't flinch. You blinked like you'd swallowed gravel." He couldn't argue with that. They worked mostly in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, just shared. Every so often, Lena would ask a question about the build, how the shock absorption would work, or how the front wheels would pivot. Chris answered with the quiet confidence of someone whose hands had known wood and steel for decades. Around midday, Lena leaned back on the stool and glanced at a faded photo of Maggie pinned to the corkboard. "She was beautiful," she said gently. Chris didn't look up. "She was funny, too. Witty. And smarter than me, by a mile." "You miss her," he nodded. "Every hour. But not the way people think. It's not sobbing in the dark. It's like background noise, like the hum of a fridge, always there, even when you forget it." Lena was quiet for a while. Then she whispered, "That's exactly how I feel about my husband." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither said a word. Nothing needed to be said. Grief recognizes grief. By late afternoon, the leather seat was taking shape. Chris had cut and stitched it by hand, occasionally letting Lena help guide the thread through the punched holes. "I haven't sewn since high school," she confessed, "and that was a pajama top. It was terrible." Chris chuckled. "Well, now you can say you helped sew a miracle." She smiled, then paused. "Do you believe in miracles, Chris?" He thought for a moment. "I believe in effort, and sometimes, when effort meets the right kind of need. Yeah. Maybe." As they worked, Eli burst into the garage holding something behind his back. "I have a surprise," he declared. Chris turned, raising an eyebrow. "Uh-oh." Eli proudly presented a small box wrapped in newspaper comics and duct tape. "For the bride," he beamed. "I made it in art class." Lena crouched beside him, her face alight with tenderness. "Can she open it?" "Open it tomorrow when she visits again," Eli said seriously. "It's not dry yet." Chris took the box carefully and set it on a shelf. After Eli left, Chris said, "He gets that from his mother." "What? The sweetness?" "No. The belief that even small things can matter big." The next day, Claire returned. This time, she spoke. "Hi," she said softly, as Lena wheeled her in. Chris smiled. "Hey there." Claire's eyes scanned the evolving wedding ride, now complete with its padded seat, polished frame, and delicate carved initials on the headrest. C+T, Claire and Thomas. "Can I try it?" she asked. "Almost," Chris said. "One more piece to finish." He walked over to a shelf, took the small box Eli had made, and returned. "This," he said, "is from my son." Claire opened it slowly. Inside was a tiny wooden heart on a thin chain. It was misshapen, clearly handmade, painted with soft lilac and navy blue swirls. "It's beautiful," Claire whispered, voice cracking. "Please tell him thank you." Chris cleared his throat. "He'll be thrilled." Claire touched the seat gently. "This is the first time I've felt excited since the accident." Lena stepped beside her, hand on her shoulder. "You deserve this. All of it." Chris watched them, the bond, the bravery, the quiet grace, and felt something shift in his chest. The ache of loss was still there, but something else was blooming in its place. Something like beginning. The morning after Claire's visit felt different. Chris couldn't explain it exactly, only that the air seemed lighter, the garage warmer, the old tools a bit more willing to cooperate. There was a rhythm to the day again, not just in the physical sense, but in his spirit. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just fixing things, He was creating. He opened the garage early, swept the sawdust with quiet care, and set the wedding ride under the natural light coming through the window. It glowed, as if Maggie's touch still lingered in the corners. By 8 o'clock, Lena arrived with her usual smile and a paper bag of fresh lemon scones. "Morning," she called, setting down her bag and brushing flecks of sugar from her gloves. "Thought we'd earned something sweet today." Chris nodded, offering a rare smile. "We might have." They sat outside on overturned crates, sipping tea from mismatched mugs. Lena's had a crack in the handle, taped together with floral-patterned washi tape. Chris liked that. It felt honest, kept, not discarded. "You ever think we end up exactly where we need to be?" she asked suddenly. Chris glanced at her, amused. "That sounds like something a preacher would say." Lena shrugged. "Or a nurse. We see enough broken things to start believing in quiet miracles." Chris stirred his tea with the tip of his finger. "Sometimes I think I was meant to stay broken. For Maggie's memory. For Eli. Like moving on would be betrayal." Lena didn't flinch. "It's not betrayal. It's survival. Maggie wouldn't want you to live in pieces." Chris didn't answer, but his silence wasn't rejection. It was reflection. Back inside, they got to work on the final embellishments. Lena helped select the fabric lining for the interior of the ride, soft ivory with tiny silver stitching. Chris cut the pieces carefully, measuring twice, smoothing the edges with sandpaper. His hands worked on instinct, but his heart was focused elsewhere. "How's Claire feeling?" he asked after a while. Lena hesitated. "Hopeful. Nervous. She's worried about people staring." Chris frowned. "They'll stare no matter what. People don't always know how to look at strength." "That's why this matters," Lena said. "Because she'll be seen as a bride, not as a girl in a chair." Chris nodded. Around noon, they broke for lunch. Simple grilled ham and cheese, which Lena insisted on making in a small electric sandwich press she'd brought from home. "It's vintage," she said, proud. "Just like you." Chris laughed, a dry, unexpected chuckle that surprised even him. They ate in companionable silence until a knock sounded on the side door. It was Mr. Dunley, the elderly woodworker who lived 3 houses down. He stood with a cane in one hand and a folded tarp in the other. "Heard you were building something special," the old man said, eyes bright. "Thought you might need some of this." Chris took the tarp, unrolling it halfway to reveal a selection of hand-carved trim, floral and vine patterns etched into soft pine. "These were my wife's designs," Dunley said. "Made them for our 40th anniversary, but she passed before I could use them. Figured maybe someone else's bride could ride with them." Chris's throat tightened. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use them," Dunley replied. "That's all?" Chris nodded. "I will. Thank you." As Dunley left, Lena whispered, "You ever think kindness attracts kindness?" Chris looked down at the delicate carvings in his hands. Maybe kindness just wakes it back up. That evening, Chris worked later than usual. Eli sat nearby on a pile of blankets, coloring in a notebook while humming softly. Chris traced the woodwork onto the side panels of the wedding ride, taking special care to place Dunley's designs near the entry step, where Claire's hand would fall first. When he finished, he stood back and took in the whole piece. It wasn't just functional. It was beautiful. Handmade. Honored. Whole. Eli peered up. "Is it done?" Chris wiped his brow. "Almost. Just one last thing." He opened a drawer in the old workbench, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside was Maggie's keychain. It was simple. A small bronze pendant that read, "Let love move you." He unscrewed the back panel of the ride and placed the keychain inside, tucked into the wood like a secret. Not to be seen, just to be there. "Can we tell her?" Eli asked. Chris smiled gently. "No, It's just for her to feel, even if she doesn't know it. The next morning, Lena brought Claire again. Chris stepped forward as Lena helped her into the wedding ride for the first time. Claire adjusted herself slowly, then stilled. A long pause passed. "It feels right," she whispered. "Like it was made with care. Like someone saw me." Chris met her eyes. "I did." Claire reached down, her fingers brushing the carved step. "It's warm," she said, almost to herself. Lena wiped her eyes before anyone could see. Claire looked up at Chris. "Thank you for giving me back a piece of the day I thought I'd lost." Chris swallowed hard. "You haven't lost it. You just changed it." The day before the wedding rehearsal dawned with a strange calmness. Chris stood in his kitchen, pouring cereal for Eli, while the radio murmured soft gospel in the background. Outside, the clouds hung low, but not threatening, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Eli sat cross-legged at the table, swinging his feet, crunching loudly. "Is today the big test drive?" Chris nodded, sipping his coffee. "Claire's going to try the full aisle path, just to see how it feels." Eli beamed. "She's gonna love it." Chris looked at his son, this earnest little soul with wild cowlicks and peanut butter smudges, and thought of how much of Maggie lived in that face, not just in the eyes or the smile, but in the heart. As they stood to clear the table, Eli ran back to his room and returned holding something small wrapped in tissue paper. "I found this in Mom's old drawer," he said. "Can we give it to Claire tomorrow?" Chris took it gently and unwrapped the soft fabric to reveal a delicate piece of lavender ribbon, hand-dyed, faded with time. Maggie had used it to wrap birthday gifts, tie love notes, and once as a makeshift bookmark in her battered poetry collection. "She always said purple was for brave people," Eli added with a proud grin. Chris nodded, his throat thick. "We'll find the perfect place for it." At the chapel grounds, the atmosphere was quiet. The path Claire would ride down stretched from the gravel parking lot, across a grassy field, and up to a white gazebo nestled under an oak tree. The setup was rustic, handcrafted wooden benches, flower petals scattered in preparation, fairy lights half-strung overhead. The wedding ride was already there, covered in linen to protect it from dust. Chris removed the sheet slowly, revealing the now-finished piece, satin-lined, trimmed with Dunley's carvings, polished to a soft gleam. It looked almost too noble for something born in a dusty garage. Lena and Claire arrived shortly after, the latter wearing a cream blouse and a crown of dried flowers. Her eyes scanned the scene with quiet reverence. Chris approached with his usual quiet demeanor. "Ready?" Claire nodded. Her hand shook slightly as she wheeled herself forward. Chris steadied the wedding ride as Lena helped Claire transfer into the seat. It fit her like it had always been waiting for her. She leaned back, adjusted her posture, and whispered, "It feels like a dress, like a real one, not something borrowed from someone else's world." Chris swallowed hard. "It's yours." Lena walked to the front of the path. "All right, let's try this out." Chris grasped the handles at the back and began guiding Claire down the aisle. The wheels rolled over the path with surprising grace. No jostling, no catches, just a soft glide like a slow dance. Halfway through the path, Claire looked up at the trees above, her eyes glassy. "I didn't think I'd feel this again," she said. "Like I'm not broken. Like I still get to have moments." Chris didn't reply. He didn't need to. At the gazebo, a few familiar faces had gathered. Neighbors, Lena's co-workers, even Mr. Dunley with a thermos of soup and a walking stick. "Just came to see beauty in motion," he said, tipping his hat. Claire rested in the wedding ride, while Lena fluffed her blouse and checked her hair. Chris stood beside the bench where Eli waited. "You think she likes it?" the boy whispered. Chris looked at Claire, her hands folded delicately, her head lifted with the posture of someone ready to be seen, truly seen. "She doesn't just like it," Chris said. "She believes in it." Eli grinned, then fished the lavender ribbon from his coat pocket. "Where should it go?" Chris hesitated, then walked back to the ride and knelt. With slow hands, he tied the ribbon around one of the carved side rails, just tight enough to stay, just loose enough to flutter. Claire looked down at it, smiled. "That's beautiful." "It was your mother's," Chris said softly. "She always tied it to things she believed in." Claire blinked quickly, her voice trembling. "Then it's perfect." That night, after the rehearsal ended and the small crowd had dispersed, Chris lingered at the garage. The wedding ride was parked once more in its original place, under the hanging bulb. But something was different. Lena returned, this time without Claire. She wore a soft cardigan, her hair down for once. Chris looked up. "Did she get home all right?" "She did," Lena said. She didn't stop smiling. Chris nodded. "Good." Lena stepped closer. "You gave her something. No doctor, no surgery, no therapy could have given her." Chris looked at his hands, still stained with varnish. "I just built a cart." "No," Lena said gently. "You built a memory." Silence settled between them like a blanket. Then, slowly, Lena pulled something from her pocket. A tiny photograph, yellowed at the edges. It was of her and her late husband, dancing under string lights on their last anniversary. "I kept this in my wallet for 10 years, she said, "but I think it's time to stop looking back so hard." Chris took the photo carefully, studying it. Then, wordlessly, he walked to the side drawer, opened it, and placed the photo next to Maggie's sketchbook. "Now," he said, "they can keep each other company." Lena smiled through misty eyes. "I'd like that." And for the first time, Chris didn't feel guilty for smiling too. It rained the morning of the wedding. Not a storm, but the kind of steady drizzle that turned gravel into soft earth and made the air smell like new beginnings. Chris stood under the edge of the garage's awning, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to the drops tap against the tin roof like a metronome. The wedding ride was ready, polished, lined, blessed by more hands and stories than he could count. Now covered in a waterproof tarp, it waited patiently by the door, like a carriage anticipating its horse. He glanced down at his boots, mud slicked. The path to the gazebo would be too soft now. Wheels could sink, slip. He'd need something sturdier, maybe planks to brace the ground. He set his mug down and stepped inside. That's when he saw the envelope. It was sitting squarely on the workbench, cream-colored, no stamp, no name. Just a thin thread of blue ribbon sealing it closed. Chris blinked. He looked around. The garage was still, quiet. He reached for the envelope with careful fingers and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, written in Maggie's handwriting. "Chris, if you're reading this, then somehow the world kept spinning and you kept going, and I am proud of you. I didn't want to leave without saying one last thing, but I knew you'd tuck this away if I gave it to you in person. So I left it with someone I trusted, someone who would know the right moment to give it to you." Chris read the next line slowly, the edges of his vision blurring. "You were never meant to stop loving, just meant to learn how to love again, differently. You're the kind of man who builds things to make people feel whole. But this time, Chris, let someone help build something for you. Let yourself be loved again. She's out there, I don't know her name, but I hope she has kind eyes, steady hands, and a laugh that makes you turn toward the sound." Chris dropped into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in his grip. A tear fell onto the paper and bloomed across Maggie's final words. "When you're ready, you'll know. I love you still. Always will." Later that morning, Lena arrived soaked through, her hair clinging to her cheeks, her smile untouched by the weather. "Rain can't stop us," she grinned, holding up a bag of waterproof seat covers and a stack of wooden planks. "Thought you might need reinforcements." Chris stared at her a beat too long, her hair, her hands, her laugh echoing through the space as she stomped water from her boots. Kind eyes, steady hands, the laugh that made him turn. He swallowed the lump in his throat and simply said, "I do." Lena paused, puzzled. "You do what?" "I do need the planks," he said with a small smile. "And you?" She looked at him curiously, but didn't press further. They worked side by side all morning, lining the aisle path with wide oak planks, hammering them into the wet soil with borrowed stakes. Eli joined later, handing them nails and snacks with solemn purpose, his raincoat several sizes too big. By noon, the clouds parted slightly, revealing shy beams of sunlight breaking through. "It's a sign," Lena whispered. Chris looked up at the clearing sky and said nothing, but he knew. It was more than a sign. It was permission. Back at the garage, while preparing the final detailing, Chris opened the small drawer beneath Maggie's sketchbook and took out the envelope again. He thought about tucking it away, somewhere hidden. But then he paused. He walked over to Lena, who was kneeling near the ride, smoothing the seat cover. "There's something I want to show you," he said. She took the letter gently, her hands wet from the fabric, but steady. As her eyes moved across the page, her breath hitched. "I had no idea," she whispered. "I didn't either," he said softly. "But she gave it to someone who waited for the right time." Lena looked up, her eyes wet, not from rain now. "It was me. Maggie gave this to me the last time I saw her at the clinic. She told me, 'Hold it for a moment when kindness feels heavier than grief.' I didn't know what she meant." Chris's voice trembled. "Now you do." They stood there, quiet, in the heart of the garage, surrounded by wood and tools and years of silence that no longer felt empty. He reached for her hand. It was warm. It fit. That evening, the wedding ride was wheeled into position one final time. Claire, radiant in her ivory gown, sat nestled inside it, her hair braided with baby's breath and her expression glowing with quiet power. People lined the wooden path, umbrellas in hand, mist on their faces, but hearts open. And Chris, standing near the archway, felt something in his chest uncoil. Not grief letting go, but love rising to meet him again. The sun returned just in time. By the hour of the wedding, the clouds had parted like theater curtains, revealing a warm light that spilled over the chapel lawn in soft gold. The rain left behind the scent of pine, earth, and beginnings, fresh and electric. Chris stood beside the wedding ride, running a hand along its polished frame. It looked more alive now than it ever had. Every curve, every carving, every gentle slope carried a story. Of loss, yes, but more than that. Of transformation. Nearby, Eli tugged at his too small blazer, muttering about itchy collars. Chris knelt down to straighten his son's lapel. "You look sharp, buddy," Eli grinned. "Do I get to drive it someday?" "Not today," Chris chuckled. "Today, it's for someone else." Guests began arriving in slow waves. Neighbors from the town, Claire's teachers, some of Thomas's distant relatives, even two of Lena's former patients, who now walked without canes. There were no pews, no marble aisle, just benches in the grass, lined with sprigs of lavender and baby's breath, and the long wooden path that Chris, Lena, and Eli had built, plank by plank. Claire arrived in the small white van Lena had rented. Chris stepped forward as the doors opened. Claire sat inside in her dress, luminous, Not the kind of luminous that came from sequins or powder, but from within, a light made of courage. Chris reached out his hand. "Ready?" Claire took it. Lena helped steady her as she moved into the wedding ride. Her dress pooled perfectly around her legs. The satin lining shimmered in the sun. When Claire was settled, she looked up at Chris and whispered, "You built me freedom." He swallowed hard. "I built it with help." Lena joined the line of guests, her eyes never leaving Chris as he stepped behind the wedding ride and took hold of its handles. For a moment, the air stilled. Then, music began. Soft strings and piano, simple and honest, the kind Maggie used to hum in the mornings. And Chris began to walk. Every step was steady. The wheels moved like they were dancing. Guests stood as the ride passed by, some with hands over their hearts, others with tears they didn't bother to wipe away. Claire didn't wave. She didn't smile broadly. But she looked into each face, head high, grace pouring from her like sunlight through glass. And then, at the halfway point, something unexpected happened. One of the older guests, a man in a suit far too big for him, stepped into the aisle, holding a cane. He placed it beside him and began to clap. A slow, measured clap. One beat at a time. Another person joined, then another, until the entire crowd was standing in silence, clapping. Not as applause, but as reverence. The kind of sound you make when you recognize something sacred. Chris didn't stop walking, but his vision blurred, and for a moment, he imagined Maggie beside him, whispering, "This is why we build." When they reached the gazebo, Claire's groom, Thomas, was waiting. Tall, gentle, his suit wrinkled in all the right places. His hands shook as he helped her from the ride. They didn't need vows. Their eyes said everything. The officiant's voice carried gently over the breeze. When he finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Thomas leaned down, kissed Claire's forehead, and then rested his own against hers, whispering something only she heard. She laughed. It was the first time Chris had ever heard her laugh. It sounded like wind through pine trees. The reception was held right there on the lawn, a long wooden table with wildflowers and paper lanterns, kids running between folding chairs, Mr. Dunley playing harmonica, while Lena danced with a toddler in her arms. Chris sat on the edge of the gathering, watching it all, savoring it like the last spoonful of something sweet. Then Lena sat beside him, brushing a leaf off her shoulder. "Where's Eli?" "Building a fort out of tablecloths." Lena laughed. "Good. Someone should." They sat in silence for a while before Chris turned toward her. "You kept that letter for years, and today you gave it back to the right hands." "I didn't give it back," Lena said, looking at him. "I gave it forward." Chris reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded napkin. Inside was the bronze keychain, the one Maggie had left him. He placed it in her palm. "She'd want you to have this now." Lena traced the engraving. "Let love move you." Her eyes softened. "She moved you, didn't she?" Chris nodded. "And now, maybe, I get to move again." Lena leaned her head on his shoulder. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. 2 days after the wedding, the town was still humming with a kind of quiet joy. People lingered longer at the grocery store. Strangers smiled more freely. It was as if something had shifted, subtly, beautifully, and no one wanted to be the first to move on too quickly. Chris stood outside the garage, wiping down the wedding ride with a soft cloth. It sat beneath the open bay door, catching afternoon light like it belonged to another time. A museum piece, a memory made solid. He wasn't sure what to do with it now. "You could rent it out," Eli offered, skipping stones on the gravel. "Let other people feel special." Chris smiled. "It's not the kind of thing you charge for." "Then give it away." Chris paused. "Maybe, That afternoon, Lena stopped by with a thank you basket, fresh scones, a jar of strawberry preserves, and a note in Claire's handwriting. "You didn't just build a ride. You gave me a moment I never thought I'd have again. I'll never forget it. Neither will anyone who saw it." Chris read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with Maggie's sketchbook. "Town's still talking," Lena said, sipping tea from a mismatched mug. "My shift at the clinic felt like group therapy. Everyone wanted to talk about the wedding, about you." Chris raised a brow. "Me?" She nodded. "The man who builds with grief and gives it back as grace," he chuckled. "Sounds a little dramatic. They think you're a miracle worker. I'm just a mechanic." Lena set down her mug. "Maybe. But you're a mechanic who knew that some things can't be fixed, only carried better." Just then, a sound rolled down the road, low, deep, unfamiliar. Chris stepped outside. From the bend beyond the pine trees, a line of black SUVs emerged, sleek, identical, moving in perfect silence. 1, 2, 3, 10 in total. They pulled up in a staggered line, parking across the gravel drive in front of the garage. Dust settled behind them like a curtain lowering on a stage. Chris blinked. "You expecting company?" Lena shook her head slowly, eyes wide. "Not unless I won the lottery." The doors opened, and out stepped people, men and women of all ages, dressed in smart coats and boots too clean for country roads. But it wasn't their clothes that caught Chris's attention. It was their faces. He knew them. Not all, but some. The single mother whose tire he'd replaced at midnight during a snowstorm. The teenage boy he'd taught how to change oil when no one else had time for him. The old man he used to help carry groceries from the co-op when Maggie was still alive. And more. Faces he hadn't seen in years. Faces he'd forgotten. But they hadn't forgotten him. One by one, they approached. The woman from the SUV nearest him stepped forward first. "Mr. Reeves?" He nodded cautiously. "We heard what you did for Claire, what you built, and more importantly, why you built it." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "A few of us. We started something. A fund. Quietly. Word spread fast after the wedding." Chris took the paper. It was a bank letter, an official confirmation of a new community nonprofit account, the Wedding Ride Foundation. "People need more than a wheelchair," the woman said. "They need dignity, ceremony, magic." Chris stood frozen. Another man stepped forward. "You changed the ending of someone's story. Now we want to help you write new ones." Another voice. "We want to help fund more rides, for other weddings, other beginnings." Eli tugged at Chris's hand. "Dad, this is the miracle part, isn't it?" Chris finally breathed. "Yes, kid. I think it is." That evening, after the SUVs had gone, and the sun dipped low across the pines, Chris stood with Lena at the threshold of the garage. The ride gleamed behind them. The letter trembled in his pocket. "You okay?" she asked. "I think," he said slowly. "I'm more than okay." She stepped closer. "You're not just fixing things anymore," she said. "You're giving people back something they thought they lost." He looked at her, really looked at her, and smiled. "So are you." Then, without ceremony or rush, he leaned in and kissed her. Softly. Not as an end, but as a beginning. 1 week after the foundation was announced, Chris's garage looked less like a workshop and more like a mission base. Blueprints lined the walls. Boxes of donated parts stood neatly labeled along the back shelves. Volunteers came in shifts. Students, retirees, even folks who didn't know a wrench from a ruler but wanted to help anyway. It was humbling. Chris stood in the center of it all, holding a pencil behind his ear and a clipboard full of sketches. Lena was beside him, clipboard in hand, equally focused. She wore reading glasses she rarely used but claimed gave her project authority. "Wedding ride number 2. What's our timeline?" she asked. Chris glanced at the plans. 2 weeks. This one's for a couple in Ohio. Bride's a cancer survivor. Wants to be escorted down a candlelit aisle in the park where they first met. Lena smiled. "Sounds like magic." Chris nodded. "We'll make it real." Each day brought new requests. A groom in Oregon who had lost both legs in Afghanistan. A bride in Georgia whose hands were paralyzed but wanted to hold wildflowers in her lap as she rode. A father with Parkinson's who just wanted to walk his daughter down the aisle. If someone could build a ride that supported both of them at once, they weren't orders. They were dreams. And Chris, for the first time in years, was a dream builder. One crisp morning, as Chris shaped a new frame from maple wood, Eli ran in holding a package. "It's from Texas," he called, waving the envelope. Chris opened it and pulled out a photo. It was a couple, newly married, holding hands in front of a small chapel with a lavender-trimmed wedding ride beside them. Tucked inside was a note. "We never thought we'd have something beautiful. We thought we'd settle for good enough. But what you gave us was unforgettable. We rode with joy, with dignity. You reminded us what ceremony feels like." Marcy and Luce. Chris passed the letter to Lena. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she whispered, "This is why we keep building." That same afternoon, the sound of engines rolled up the gravel drive again. Chris stepped outside, expecting deliveries, or maybe another neighbor bringing muffins. But what he saw made him freeze. The SUVs were back. 10 of them. The same ones. Black, polished, lined up like a procession. This time, when the doors opened, it wasn't donors who stepped out. It was couples. 10 of them. Each had ridden in a wedding ride that Chris and his growing team had crafted. Each had made a journey of their own, from fear to love, from pain to hope. They walked across the drive as if choreographed by something deeper than planning. One couple brought a baby girl wrapped in a quilt stitched with hearts. Another brought a service dog wearing a bow tie. Some walked, some wheeled, all beamed. Chris stepped forward, stunned. "What is this?" A man in a navy suit smiled. "It's a thank you." A woman with salt and pepper hair nodded. "We wanted to return the wheels, but also to remind you what you're building." Eli tugged at his father's sleeve. "They're like the Ride family, aren't they?" Chris nodded slowly. "Yeah, they are." Lena whispered, "This is the part no one expects, the ripple that comes back." Each couple brought something to leave behind. A carved wooden plaque. Love, moved. A book filled with photos from weddings. A check from a florist who had donated flowers for every ride in the past month. A little girl in pigtails drew a picture of Mr. Chris with a hammer and angel wings. Chris didn't cry, but he stepped aside, laid down his tools, and let himself be surrounded. He shook hands, accepted hugs, listened to stories, laughed through disbelief. He didn't know what to say. But Lena knew. She touched his hand and whispered, "Say nothing. Just receive it. This is love, coming home." That night, as the garage grew quiet again, Chris sat alone for a while. He turned the pages of the photo book. He traced the edge of the plaque. Then he opened Maggie's sketchbook. On the last page, one he'd never dared to look at before, was a simple note. "If you ever feel lost, build something for someone else. Love will always find you there." Chris closed the book. Then he turned off the lights. Because he knew, tomorrow, there'd be another ride to build. The wedding ride sat under a canvas cover now, tucked near the garage's back wall, resting like a retired champion. It had carried more than brides and grooms. It had carried weight, hope, history. Chris knew they would build more, but this one, the original, would stay. A monument not just to love, but to the moment his own heart had shifted course. He sat alone that evening, tracing a new design. This one for a child-sized ride shaped like a storybook carriage. A 7-year-old girl in Utah had written to the foundation asking if she could feel like a princess, even though my legs don't work so good. Her crayon drawing was still pinned to the workbench wall. Chris smiled at the memory of it. Then he heard footsteps. Not heavy. Not rushed. Familiar. Lena. She wore jeans and a soft flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, hair slightly windblown. She didn't knock. She never had to. Claire dropped off more thank you notes, she said, holding a small bundle tied with twine. She says she's finally writing again. Chris looked up. That's something. She said the ride made her believe in forward motion again. He nodded. Maybe that's all we ever really need. Some kind of movement. Lena smiled, then spotted the child's drawing on the wall. Is that our next project? Chris nodded again, quieter this time. She wants purple wheels and glitter. Lena laughed. She'll get it. They stood in silence a while longer, the kind that rests between people who have shared more than words. Chris broke it softly. Can I ask you something? Of course. He held up a small ring box. Nothing flashy, just simple wood, the grain smoothed with time. Inside was Maggie's wedding ring. I don't know if I'll ever get married again, he said, voice raw. But I'd like to give this to someone who helped me find my way back. Lena's breath caught. Chris, I'm not asking for anything today, or even tomorrow. I just want you to have it. Not as a promise of marriage, but a promise I won't keep holding back. He placed the box gently in her hand. I'm still learning how to be present, he continued, but I'm here. Fully. Finally. Tears filled Lena's eyes, not from sorrow, but from recognition. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. I don't need perfect, she whispered. I just need real. Chris exhaled, as if for the first time in years. They stood like that for a long while, his hands on her back, hers at the base of his neck. The world outside faded into nothing but the steady rhythm of two hearts trying again. Later that night, they sat on the back porch with mugs of warm cider. Eli had gone to bed after proudly showing off his floor plan for the foundation's dream headquarters, complete with a candy machine and nap zones. Lena chuckled. He's got vision, Chris nodded. That he does. They watched the stars blink into view, one by one. I think Maggie would have liked you, Lena said softly. Chris turned. Why? Because you remind me of her, not in looks, but in presence. There's a calm you carry, and a kind of stubborn kindness she used to wear like armor. Chris smiled. She always said I needed someone who could read between my silences. Lena nudged him gently. Lucky for you, I'm fluent. A long pause. Then Chris reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a folded paper. She wrote me one more letter, he said. I found it taped behind the last page of her sketchbook. He handed it to Lena. She unfolded it slowly. Chris, if you've found this, it means you've kept going. Good. Let yourself be seen. Let yourself be loved. The right one will not ask you to forget me. She'll carry my memory with you. Together. When you find her, tell her this from me. Thank you. Thank you for loving the man I loved, for helping him live again. Lena pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closed, and then, softly, I think I needed her permission more than I realized. Chris reached for her hand. No more permission needed. We're already here. She nodded. And somewhere in the still night, the world shifted, just a little, to make room for two people who had lost and found and chosen to begin again. Spring came early that year, not in flowers or sunshine, but in spirit. A kind of warming from within that settled over the town like a blanket. You could see it in the way folks lingered longer on porches, in the laughter that spilled more freely across the farmers' market, and in how people looked one another in the eye more than before. Chris stood at the front of the new foundation space, a converted barn gifted by the town council. The siding was still half painted, but the spirit inside was unmistakable. Blueprints lined the walls, handprints of volunteers pressed into concrete, and the scent of fresh sawdust lingering like a familiar song. At the center of the barn stood the very first wedding ride, now mounted slightly elevated under soft lighting. Beneath it read a small plaque, the one that carried us all. He turned as Lena approached with 2 mugs of cider and a paper folder. Her smile hadn't changed. It still arrived softly, as if asking permission to bloom. She handed him the folder. "Final grant paperwork. It's official. We're now fully funded for 3 years." Chris raised his eyebrows. 3? 2 more than we asked for, Lena said. "Turns out kindness returns interest." They both laughed, gently, naturally. Later that afternoon, a local reporter visited to do a story on the foundation's growth. The journalist, a woman in her early 40s with notebook and camera in hand, asked the usual questions. What inspired the first ride? How did the idea grow? How many had they built now? Chris answered patiently. Lena chimed in with details, but then came the question that stopped him still. What made you keep going? After the first ride was finished, why not stop there? Chris looked around, at the open barn doors where children played tag, at the corkboard, filled with pinned wedding photos, at the table where Eli sat, drawing a new sign that read, "Let love roll on." He turned back to the reporter. Because it never felt like an ending. It felt like a beginning disguised as a goodbye. She smiled and wrote that line down. But it wasn't for the article. It was for herself. That weekend, they held a community event. Not a fundraiser, not even a ceremony. Just a picnic. Everyone brought something. Mr. Dunley grilled. Claire brought gluten-free cupcakes. Someone started a folk band near the sycamores. At some point in the evening, Chris stepped up to the old wooden crate they used as a makeshift podium. He didn't have a speech prepared, but he didn't need one. He looked at the crowd and said, "I used to believe building things was the best way to stay busy, but then I learned building with people is the best way to stay open. This ride didn't change just one life. It changed mine. And you made sure it never stopped rolling." Applause came not with roar, but with warmth, the kind that makes your chest ache in the best way. As the sun lowered, Eli stood next to Lena, holding a mason jar of lemonade and squinting at the sky. "Dad says people are like rides," he said. "Oh?" Lena smiled. "Yeah, sometimes we need help moving forward, but once we do, we help carry others." Lena looked at him thoughtfully. "Your dad's a smart man." "Sometimes," Eli said, "mostly when he's not trying to cook." They both laughed. As twilight deepened, Chris and Lena walked down the gravel path behind the barn. Fireflies lit the edge of the trees. The wind was soft, the silence full. Chris paused at the place where the very first wedding ride test run had started months ago. He turned to her. "You know, I think Maggie would have loved this place." Lena nodded. "I think she does." He reached for her hand. "We're not fixing broken things here, are we?" She shook her head. "No. We're giving them shape, so they can move forward again." They stood there a while longer, 2 hearts no longer afraid of starting over. Before locking up for the night, Chris passed by the original wedding ride one last time. Eli had taped a note to the base earlier in the day. Crayon scrawled, slightly crooked, written in big block letters. "To anyone who needs a little help to feel strong, this ride is for you. Love, Eli." Chris smiled. He didn't adjust the note. He didn't edit the message. It was already perfect. And as the lights dimmed and the barn settled into hush, the ride stayed where it was. Ready, because sometimes the most beautiful journeys don't end at the altar. They begin in a quiet garage with tools in hand and a heart that dares to build again. Where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know. Drop a comment below and share your corner of the world with us. It always warms my heart to see how far kindness can travel. And if you enjoy stories like this, quiet, powerful reminders of the good still left in the world, feel free to subscribe. You'll be the first to know whenever a new story is ready to lift your spirit. Thank you so much for spending your time here. It truly means more than you know.